Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about status quo bias. Sounds kind of jargony, right?
It does, a little.
But it's this super interesting thing, and it's probably affecting you way more than you realize. It explains why, like, you might be sticking with your same old phone plan, even though there are way better deals out there.
Right, and we'll be looking at some research from different fields today.
Yeah, psychology, economics, even a little bit of political science. So, what exactly is status quo bias?
Well, it's basically like this tendency we all have to just stick with what we're already doing, even if it might not be the best choice anymore. It's that comfort in the familiar, you know?
Yeah, totally. Better the devil you know, right?
Exactly. But sometimes that devil might be costing you money or even holding you back in other ways.
Okay, that makes sense. So why do we do this? Why do we cling to things even when they're not working for us anymore?
Well, a big part of it, like they talk about in overcoming status quo bias in the human brain, is that it's literally wired into our brains. There's this part of the brain called the subthalamic nucleus.
Whoa, fancy name.
Yeah, it's involved in like rejecting the default option, especially when a decision is really difficult.
So basically, our brains are working overtime just to break away from the familiar.
Pretty much. And this bias, it actually gets even stronger when things are uncertain, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it.
Makes sense to me. Uncertainty is scary.
Exactly. There's another paper, Resistance to Reform, Status Quo Bias in the Presence of Individual-Specific Uncertainty, that shows that fear of the unknown can really amp up our desire to just stay put. You know, it's like we'd rather deal with a problem we know than risk jumping into something new that could be even worse.
Oh yeah, I totally get that. So it's like our brains were trying to protect us from potential danger by keeping us in our comfort zones.
Right. But like a lot of things, sometimes it goes a bit overboard.
So this is all starting to sound a little bit familiar to me. Is this connected to that sunk cost fallacy thing? You know, like when you keep pouring money into a failing project just because you've already invested so much?
Absolutely. That's a classic example of status quo bias at play. And to make things even trickier, we tend to overestimate the costs of switching to something new while underestimating the benefits.
So it's a combination of our brains trying to be efficient, our fear of the unknown, and our own kind of warped perception of the situation.
Pretty much. It's this really fascinating mix of factors that makes this bias so powerful and so common.
Okay, so now I'm really curious. How does all of this actually play out in the real world? Do we have any research that shows this bias in action?
Yeah, oh, definitely. There's a really cool study from Overcoming Status Quo Bias in the Human Brain that involved a visual task. People had to say if a dot appeared inside or outside a specific area on a screen.
Sounds pretty simple.
It was. But here's the thing. Before each trial, they were given a default answer. So they were told, like, it's in or it's out.
Okay.
Yeah. As the task got harder, people were more likely to just stick with that default answer, even when it was wrong. So even with something as basic as spotting a dot, we see this pull toward the default.
Wow. So even when the stakes are low, this bias can still creep in.
For sure. Now, imagine this happening in a situation with much higher stakes, like, for example, the political arena.
Ooh, okay, that's getting interesting.
There's research in reputation-concerned policymakers and institutional status that shows how status quo bias affects politicians. It turns out they're often really hesitant to change existing policies, even if those policies aren't working very well.
So they're basically stuck in a rut too.
Yep, they're worried about looking inconsistent or incompetent if they change their minds.
So it's all about saving face.
A lot of it, yeah. They're afraid of negative public perception and potential damage to their reputation.
Okay, so this bias isn't just about personal choices. It can have huge implications for entire societies.
Exactly, and it's why it's so important to understand. But we'll get into more of that in the next part.
Okay, sounds good. I'm already starting to see things differently.
It's pretty eye-opening stuff, isn't it? Welcome back. We're diving deeper into status quo bias and looking at how it affects our decisions.
Yeah, like those Harvard employees sticking with the default health insurance plan even when there were better options. But knowing about this bias is one thing, right? What can we actually do to overcome it, make better choices?
Well, that's the question researchers are trying to figure out. And there are some interesting approaches out there.
Okay, like what?
Well, you mentioned nudges earlier.
Right, I'm curious about those.
So imagine a company is setting up a retirement savings plan for its employees.
Okay.
Instead of making it, opt-in, where employees have to actively choose to contribute, they could automatically enroll everyone at a certain level.
So you're basically making it The default, the easier choice.
Exactly. It's a little nudge in the right direction, and people can still opt out if they want to.
That's pretty clever. Does it actually work?
It does. Studies have shown that this approach can actually get way more people to save for retirement.
Wow. So we can actually use this knowledge to help people make better choices.
Absolutely. And another big one is just raising awareness of the bias itself. The more we understand it, the better we can, catch ourselves when it's happening and make more conscious decisions.
Yeah, makes sense. Knowledge is power, right?
For sure. And you might even start to spot status quo bias at play in other areas of your life. Once you start looking for it, it's kind of everywhere.
Now that you mention it, I think I'm already starting to see it. Like with those politicians clinging to their old policies, makes you wonder how many other things in society are being held back by this bias.
It's a good point. But let's switch gears for a second.
Okay.
There's this paper, Turning Pirates into Subscribers, that looks at this idea of inertia, similar to status quo bias, but in a totally different context. Online piracy.
Wait, like illegally downloading movies and music?
Exactly. They're looking at why people pirate content and how we might, nudge them towards legal alternatives.
Okay, that's an interesting angle. So it's not just about personal choices, but also like societal stuff too.
Exactly. If we can understand why people pirate, we can try to make legal options more appealing, more convenient.
Instead of just like cracking down on them.
Right. It's a different approach. So why do people pirate in the first place?
Good question. I mean, some people probably just don't care about breaking the rules, but
Yeah.
I bet there's more to it than that.
Oh, definitely. Cost is a big factor. Streaming services are cheaper than they used to be, but they still cost money.
Yeah, and piracy's free in a
Yeah.
sense, right?
Yeah.
Even if it comes with its own risks.
Right. And then there's the convenience factor. Piracy sites are often super easy to use.
I've heard that, yeah.
And legal services, they can be a hassle sometimes. Creating accounts, payment info, all that stuff.
Oh, yeah, and sometimes they have all these restrictions, like what you can watch depending on where you live. It can be a pain.
Exactly. And then there's the whole social norm thing. If all your friends are pirating, it feels more normal.
Like peer pressure, but for illegal downloads.
Right. So you see, it's not just about being cheap or, wanting to break the rules. There are all these other factors at play.
Okay, so how do we, like, change things? How do we get people to make the ethical choice?
Well, the paper talks about a few different things. First, we need to make legal services more appealing. Highlight the benefits, better quality, wider selection, all that stuff.
Yeah, make it worth paying for.
Right. And they need to be more user-friendly. Easy sign-up, different payment options.
Basically, make the ethical choice the easy choice.
Exactly. But, changing social norms, that's tougher.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It takes, public awareness campaigns to highlight the ethical issues and the impact piracy has on creators.
Right, like educate people and appeal to their sense of fairness.
Exactly. By shifting the narrative around piracy, we might be able to encourage people to make different choices.
This is all really interesting stuff. I'm starting to see how understanding this bias, this status quo bias, can help us address bigger problems, not just personal ones.
It's a powerful lens for understanding human behavior. But there's one more layer to this.
Oh, what's that?
Emotions.
Emotions. You mean it's not just about, like, logic and rational thinking?
Nope. Emotions like fear, anxiety, even nostalgia, they can all play a big role in why we resist change.
Okay, yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you hold on to things just because they bring back good memories, even if there's something better out there.
Right. But how do we study that? How do we study the role of emotions in all of this?
Good question.
Well, researchers are using all sorts of methods. They're doing surveys, behavioral experiments, even measuring people's physiological responses like heart rate and skin conductance.
Wow. So they're really trying to understand how our feelings are tied into our decisions.
Exactly. And these insights are crucial for, designing better interventions. If we know that fear is a big barrier to change, for example, we can try to address that fear directly.
So it's about understanding the whole person, not just their rational mind.
Exactly. And that brings us to the future of research on this topic.
Oh, okay. What are researchers looking at now?
Well, they're starting to ask some pretty big questions like, what's the impact of status quo bias on society as a whole? How does it affect things like technological innovation, economic growth, even culture and social norms?
Wow, so we're zooming out from individual choices to the bigger picture.
Yep. And imagine a society where status quo bias is really strong. People might be resistant to adopting new technologies.
Even if those technologies could really improve things.
Right. And that could lead to economic stagnation, businesses clinging to outdated practices, people not buying new products.
Yeah, because growth requires change.
Exactly. And what about culture and social norms? Those are basically like a product of status quo bias, right?
Yeah, I guess so. The things that are passed down through generations, those become the norm.
Right. And while tradition is important, sometimes those norms become harmful, like gender inequality or racial discrimination or even just apathy towards the environment.
Okay, so now we're talking about some pretty serious issues. So status quo bias might actually be preventing us from creating a more just and sustainable world.
That's what researchers are trying to figure out. It's a complex issue, but understanding the role of this bias could be a big step towards solving these problems.
This is all pretty mind-blowing, honestly, but studying this stuff outside of a lab must be really difficult, right?
Oh, definitely. It's hard to isolate the effects of status quo bias from all the other factors at play in the real world.
Right, because there are so many variables.
Exactly. And then there's the ethical side of things.
What do you mean?
Well, nudging individuals is one thing, but when you're talking about trying to influence social norms, cultural values, things get a lot trickier.
Yeah, you don't want to step on anyone's toes or like impose your own beliefs on others.
Right. That's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
But that's what researchers are working on, figuring out how to address this bias at a societal level in an ethical and effective way.
Okay, this has been a really eye-opening conversation.
Hmm.
We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have, but there's one last thing I want to touch on.
What's that?
We've been focusing on the downsides of status quo bias, but is it always a bad thing? Could there be times when it's actually beneficial?
Welcome back. So last time we were talking about the idea that status quo bias might not always be a bad thing, that there might actually be some upsides.
Right, exactly. We've talked a lot about how it can hinder progress and all that, but it's important to remember that it can also be a source of stability. Like, think about it. In a world that's constantly changing, a little bit of staying the course can actually be pretty comforting.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Like too much change all the time can be overwhelming, right?
For sure. If we were always questioning everything and chasing after every new idea, we'd probably never get anything done. And it could be pretty stressful, too.
True. Like sometimes it's nice to just stick with what you know.
Exactly. Status quo bias kind of lets us streamline our decision making, frees up our mental energy for other things.
That makes sense. It's like having a go-to outfit that you know always looks good. You don't have to spend time stressing about what to wear every morning.
Perfect analogy. And this efficiency, it can be really helpful, especially in situations where you need to make quick decisions.
Okay, so it's not just about like laziness or being afraid of new things. There are some practical benefits too.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just making things easier for us as individuals. Status quo bias can also help preserve things that are valuable to society as a whole. Traditions, institutions, social structures, all that stuff.
Right, those things that give us a sense of history and identity.
Exactly. And while it's important to be open to change, we also need to appreciate what we've inherited from those who came before us. Status quo bias can help make sure we don't just throw away things that are still working just because they're old.
So it's like a check and balance system to make sure we don't change things too quickly or without thinking them through.
Yeah, you could say that. It encourages us to be cautious and deliberate when it comes to change, to really weigh the pros and cons before making big decisions.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do we like find that sweet spot? How do we know when to embrace change and when to stick with the status quo?
That's the tricky part. There's no easy answer. It takes, judgment, critical thinking, and being open to different perspectives.
It sounds like we need to become more aware of our own biases so we
Hmm.
can, recognize when they're helping us and when they're holding us back.
I like that. Bias awareness. It's like a superpower. The more you know about your own biases, the better you can control them.
So it's about asking ourselves the right questions. Like, is this choice really working for me? Are there other options I should consider? What are the risks and benefits of each path?
Exactly. It's about being more mindful and intentional in our decision making.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. I feel like I have a much better understanding of status quo bias now. It's clearly a powerful force, and it affects us in so many ways, both good and bad.
I agree. And hopefully, this conversation has given everyone some food for thought.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep those minds open.